Okay, we're rolling.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. You all don't, you're all too young to appreciate when you get as old as me and you feel insignificant. So when you get called to speak to a bunch of people, you feel like you're important again. I used to be at NASA, and then I thought I was really important there, you know. And so, but it's great to be with you all. As Larry said, I want to share with you something that I think is a somewhat original with me. At least the part without using the Bible is original with me. I've never seen anyone approach it that way, but I want to show you why I think that is important. I'm going to start like this. If you looked around and observed humanity, I guess it would be pretty evident to you that death is everywhere. You know, everything has a life-death cycle. Vegetation, animals, and so forth. But there's one unique thing about us humans. We're the only animal that knows we're going to die. There's no evidence that other animals know that they're the animal kingdom, that they're going to die. They just, I guess, I can remember when I had a dog die, it just seemed like it started walking around and passed away. And there's no evidence that there was any fear. And yet death in our realm is, I believe, the source of all fear. Every fear we have has to do with the fact that there's death lurking out there. But for some reason, no matter where you go, all humans seem to have this in common. They don't believe that death is final. Every group of people that you study has some belief that there's something beyond what we call death when we pass from this life that we live here on earth. And they believe we're going to exist in some way. And furthermore, it's my thought that this is where religion has its origin. Almost any religion that you see seems to arise because it's trying to find the answer to the death problem. If you go to the Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, their answer to this is reincarnation. Believing that, you know, you're going to die, but your spirit is going to house in another body and you will live again. In fact, the only one that I know of that has made that statement is the, now all of a sudden I can't think of over in Nepal, the what?
Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama, yeah, the Dalai Lama. I studied with a Chinese guy, and he was the one that told me that the Dalai Lama is one who has been reincarnated. Of course, How you can determine that, I don't know. You know, back when I was a kid, we used to hear that the American Indians had their happy hunting grounds. You know, that there was going to be something one day where they would hunt with after this life is over. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam talk about an afterlife that we call heaven and hell. They all have that in common. Heaven, they say, is a place of joy, and hell being a place of punishment. And there's one unique thing about Christianity. All the others believe that your afterlife is the quality of it is going to be determined by how you live in this life. For instance, Judaism or Islam both say, you know, I had a fellow, I was a professor at UAH, and I had a fellow professor named Dr. Abu Shagar, and I don't know whether any of you ever happened to meet him or not, but he was the imam for the Muslims in this area, a very fine fellow from Libya. And I had him over to speak to us after 9/11 and asked him, you know, why maybe that happened, and of course he said it was people that didn't really believe in what Islam was all about. But I asked him, how do you know what's going to happen, how you're going to have this heaven or hell? And he said, well, you do good deeds, and you pray to Mecca 5 times a day, and he had about 4 or 5 things that you did, and I said, how do you know when you've done enough? And he said, well, I hadn't thought about it, but I guess when the number of good things that you've done exceed the number of bad things, then you know. And that fellow, by the way, he went to Libya when they had the big revolution over there and became the prime minister for a short period of time. But they ousted him, so I don't know what's happened to him. Anyhow, the interesting thing is that I wanted to make from all that is the fact that all religions except Christianity have the afterlife is determined by how well you live this life. Christianity has one difference in that, a major difference. And Christianity says that your afterlife has nothing to do with what you do in this life, but with what your relationship is with Jesus. And that's what determines is that relationship. Of course, all Christians do good things, but the good things are not for the purpose of attaining heaven, but the relationship is what brings you to heaven, and it's the good things arise from your joy of having that assurance. Of course, we all probably are familiar, living in a country like we do, that this Jesus of Nazareth was a human being claimed to be, and claimed to be the Son of God. Now, I've said all that to say this. Why should we believe any of these things? Why should we believe even the fact that Jesus says he was the Son of God, Son of the Creator? Or why should we believe Islam? Why should we believe any particular one? And all except Christianity offer only the philosophy of the founder of that religion as the reason why they say that you will have whatever blessings that particular religion has. In other words, Buddhism or whatever, it's simply whether you adhere to the philosophy that Buddha had espoused, and similar with Mohammed and so forth. So why believe any of these? And Christianity has the unique thing is that there's one thing that draws you into a relationship with Jesus, and that is that you believe he was the Son of God, and the proof that he is offered was that he rose from the dead. He even supposedly in the New Testament told his apostles that was what was going to happen. So what we are faced with then is, how do we know that he did rise from the dead? And of course, that's the reason I'm here. And I have given you an outline that I'm going to follow. I have a number of other things that I'd like to cover, but I want to make sure I cover this part, and if you have further questions, we can look at those. But what I am proposing is that I want to prove to you, and I have come up with this because I went to graduate school in Boston, and up until I had done that, I had never questioned my own belief. But I got up there and I found a lot of seemingly brilliant men who didn't seem to hold the same belief that I did. And so all of a sudden it just hit me, well, why do I believe it? And I started wrestling with it because I guess up until that point I believed it because my mother and dad said it was so, and I had gone to church, Sunday school, and so forth, and so I was sort of a person that never had any real reason to question it. But all of a sudden, I looked at these men and I said, well, why don't they believe that? And it really bothered me, and I paced the floor and everything, and until I happened to find a book in the library at MIT, in the Sloan Library, and it was a book written by Alexander Campbell, and it was about the evidence for Christianity. Well, I read that, and that at least quelled my problems for a while, but I still was not particularly happy because for the most part, everyone that I could find in the Christian realm always start with the fact that we have this book here. And for the most part, as far as I could tell, and I've studied it quite a bit, we start and we say, well, this is the Word of God. And so we read in here, of course, that says that Jesus rose from the dead. But I said, well, how do I know this is true? And so I spent a lot of time, and this is what I came up with, is what I want to present to you. And here's the reason. I approach it completely different. I want to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And from that, if he did rise from the dead, he must be God. And if he is God, certainly I would believe that he would want to leave with us at least something of what he wanted for those who would believe that to believe. And so one of the things that I found is also very unique is, and you may not have ever thought about this, but there is no other place that you can find anything about Jesus' life and teachings except in this. There's no historical record of what he believed or what he taught. Now, there's a lot of historical record of his existence, and that's what we're going to talk about, but not of what he believed and he taught. This is the only place you can have it. So my approach is, if he's God, he's left us something, and that takes us to this. And so we come to this after we have concluded that. And the way I came up with this is I noticed that in this book, that's what the apostles never went and said, you got to believe the Bible. They just went out and started telling everybody there was a man who claimed to be God. We knew him. We saw him die on a cross, and we saw him after 3 days alive. And that was their message to everybody. And if you'll read the New Testament, you'll find that that's basically all that they ever taught. Now, we've developed a lot of theology around that, but that's basically all the apostles ever said was. And when people believed that, of course, like what I'm saying, they said, what does he want us to do? And so, now, let me see if I can go through my, I hope you, is there any question up to this as to how I've arrived at where I'm going and what I want to teach you? Any question? All right, I say here that I want to pursue a proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now you maybe think I'm trying to hedge a little bit there, but I don't know, have any of you ever served on a jury? If you serve on a jury, the judge always tells you that the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. And what that means is, if the defense doesn't have to prove that he's innocent. The defense, all they have to do is come up with some other possible scenario that puts reasonable doubt upon the prosecution's. You see what I'm saying there? The defense doesn't have to. And so in the case that I'm going to prove, if at the end of my proof you can come up with another scenario other than that he rose from the dead that fits the data that we know historically, then I haven't proven it. So I want you to be thinking about it. If you have a question whether or not that this does indeed prove it. Because I want to know. I'm still a little cynical that I'm not. I want to know if it's true or it isn't true, because as I was talking with my friend from Russia, I believe Jesus is the meaning of life. Without him, there is no meaning to this life. You can talk about everything ends, right? Except Jesus. And so, that's what I mean by prove beyond a reasonable doubt. That Jesus of Nazareth, now that's important. Jesus of Nazareth is a name given just like our name. Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead bodily. And that's important. What I mean by that is he was just like you and me. His resurrection was one where I could pinch him, I could talk to him if I'd been there and so forth. He was, there's no doubt that he was in a body. And it was the body that he went into the grave with. And he came out with. A spiritual resurrection would not be hard, because you'd be back to the same situation that you have with all the other philosophers. It would be a subjective thing as to whether, if it's a spiritual resurrection. And by spirit, I mean, spiritual is not right. A spirit resurrection, a spirit that at one time was housed in a body. And since we can't see it, we can't test it or anything, it would be easy to claim that. But it's not easy to claim that here it's somebody that went in with. And if you ever read some of the resurrection, the things that the New Testament talks about after the resurrection, that Jesus, he appears in a room that the doors were locked. How did he do it? Well, I don't know. I'd like to talk scientifically about it sometime, but I think there's a scientific answer to it. But whatever kind of body he had, it was a body that they could eat with him. They could see the scars in his body, so it was something that definitely was a body. So that's the two definitions that I'm making there. And the next thing I want you to see, that if the resurrection is true, it follows then that his claim that he was deity, the Son of God, is reasonable. He has a lot of other claims in the New Testament, but the fact that it's reasonable. If I told you guys, hey, I'm going to die and I'm going to come back, you'd probably say, well, Larry, who's this nut that you brought in here? But if I told you that and I got in my car and you heard a terrible crash over here and you looked over there and my Buick was torn up by some trailer truck, and you went over and said, well, that's the same guy that was talking to us, and you might even go to my funeral, but if this is Wednesday, if I or maybe Friday, if I came back Friday and appeared to you and said, yeah, I told you, then I don't think you would have any problem saying, if I've got any question, that's the guy I want to go ask a question, right? There's, if you want to have a question, Jesus is the one to go. Now, some questions, are not appropriate, but okay. So his claim of deity, he has to be considered when we view our own lives. In other words, you can't ignore somebody if he has anything to say to you. You can't ignore him if he truly rose from the dead. And eternal life, our own resurrection, which he says in the New Testament, we will be resurrected. And we'll be resurrected in a body. It won't be a spirit resurrection. And of course, as a byproduct, the inspiration of this Bible makes some sense to me, if that is really true. Okay, any questions? I've really only 3 things that I want to use to prove this. The number one is, the step 1 is, I want to prove to you that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who died on a Roman cross. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it with what's on the back of your thing. It is by historical record that we have. And I first want to define again another word, and that is historical. When I say historical, you might say, well, that's just a general term, but it has a real meaning. When I say a historical character, I don't know whether you did, but when I was a kid, I read a lot of little children's books, and what did it always start out with? Once upon a time, in a faraway place, there was a handsome prince or princess or something, and so forth. What is the situation there? What you have is sort of hazy information, right? Once upon a time, when? In a faraway place, where? There was a handsome prince. Who? So, what history is, it's times, places, persons, and events. And the book of Luke is written. Luke was a historian. And I could do this with other books, but I'm going to read you just an excerpt from Luke 3 and listen to it. It says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Ties down the time, right? When Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip was tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. What does it sound like Luke is trying to do there? Say, he's challenging you. If you don't believe me, go check the records. Go to the courthouse and see. You can. I used to use an illustration every once in a while. I'd say, what if I said to you, I live right in front of the Blossomwood School. I said back in 1960, a flying saucer landed in the Blossomwood schoolyard there, and I went over there, and some little green men got out of it, and they started talking to me and telling me all about Mars and everything. You would definitely want to get out as quick as you could, but if I said to you, I know that it sounds a little bit unusual, but if I said, well, it was during the time when Speck Searcy was mayor, that John Patterson was governor, and this is where my 86 years old gets me, but I could give you a lot of information and say, go check the Huntsville Times at the library for that date. I gave you the exact date that it happened. And if you went to the Huntsville Library and found an excerpt that said about it, you'd say, maybe this guy isn't as nutty as we thought he was. But the point is, he's a historical figure. Jesus was a historical figure. He lived in times, places, persons, and events happened around his life. So that's what I mean by definition of historical. Now, I want you to turn on the back, and I have some evidence here. I hope yours has underlines, but there's 3 different sets of historical evidence I have. There's a whole bunch, and I put a few of them on here, and I only want to look at maybe 2 or 3 of them, but I want to look at Jewish sources to begin with, and then I want to look at early Gentile sources, and then I want to look at late historian sources. And all of these, for the most part, I found in a little book down at the bottom there. You probably see it. Yeah, there it is. It's someplace. I thought I had it there. There's a little book called The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? That's where I found it. Someplace. I tried to attribute where I got the information, but some of them I have in my own library, some of the things, after I learned it from him. Okay, the ones where there's an underline, I want to read it, and the first one is evidence of early Jewish writers. When I copied this, some of you may have not gotten mine's got it up there, but I didn't do a good job of, on the copying machine, maybe to do it. It says, as the Mishnah is a law code, that's the first 5 books, and the Talmuds are the commentaries, that's the Jewish Talmuds, they're commentaries on this law code. There's little occasion in these writings for references to Christianity, and what references there are hostile. I want to make the point that everything I'm going to read to you, the source that I'm going to read to you is a source that does not believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be. They're all hostile, and so I'm giving you hostile sources. But remember, all I'm trying to prove here is not that Jesus rose from the dead at this point. All I'm trying to prove to you is he existed as a historical figure and died on a Roman cross. That's all I want to convince you, because if he wasn't a historical figure and he didn't die on a Roman cross, then resurrection doesn't have much point. And he says, according to earlier rabbis whose opinions are recorded in these writings, Jesus of Nazareth was a transgressor. See, they didn't like him in Israel, who practiced magic. They didn't believe his miracles. He scorned the words of the wise, led the people astray, and said he had not come to destroy the law, but to add to it. He was hanged on Passover Eve for heresy and misleading the people, and his disciples, of whom 5 are named, healed the sick at his name. Now there, I think you can believe that these guys were not sympathetic to Jesus, but they didn't doubt that he was a a Jewish guy that lived during their time. Okay, drop down. The next one is number 5 I have on there. And I have this a copy of this book. I found it in the library and copied this out of it. And he says, the greatest Roman historian in the days of the empire was Cornelius Tacitus, who was born between AD 52 and 54 and wrote the history of Rome under emperors. Now notice 52 to 54, when he was born, Jesus had just been crucified maybe 20 years. So he wrote near the end of the 1st century. But he's writing about what happened during Jesus' life. And he said he wrote the history of Rome under the emperors about the age of 60 when writing the history of the reign of Nero, 54 to 68. He described the great fire which ravaged Rome in AD 64 and told how it was widely rumored that Nero had instigated the fire in order to gain greater glory for himself by rebuilding the city. And that was the only thing I think I remember out of Roman history, was that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. And he says, therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, from whom they got their name, had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was emperor. You notice that matches up with what we read out of Luke. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a short time, only to break out afresh not only in Judea, the home of the plague, but in Rome itself, where all the horrible and shameful things in the world collect and find a home. Now notice that Tacitus is giving us the existence of a lot of Christians. If you've ever get to go to Rome, go to the catacombs there. Is one of the more interesting places to look at, and how these Christians lived underground in tunnels down there and buried their dead in little shelves off. And so it's a very interesting thing. But what he's saying is these Christians came from this guy Christ, and they're all over Rome, and they're a pretty bad group of people that Pontius Pilate executed. So he gives us everything there. And notice he was not sympathetic to Jesus' cause. Okay, stop me if there's anything. The next one I'm going to read is number 9, and that's Caesar and Christ by Will Durant. I have Will Durant's 10-volume history. It's a world history. And there are 3 excerpts here, and they don't come in the order I have. I mean, they don't come, the first one, the little paragraph, is not just before the next paragraph. It's further on in the context. But he says the Christian evidence for Christ begins with the letters ascribed to St. Paul. Some of these are uncertain authorship. Several antedate AD 64 are almost universally accounted as substantially genuine. No one has questioned the existence of Paul or his repeated meetings with Peter, James, and John, and so forth. So he's saying, hey, there's a lot of uncertainty about this, but Paul, we know a lot about him. There's a lot of historical evidence. And then he says, in summary, it is clear that there are many contradictions between one gospel and the other, and he's talking about the gospels, many dubious statements of history, many suspicious resemblance to the legends told of pagan gods, many incidents apparently designed to prove the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, many passages possibly aiming to establish a historical basis for some later doctrine or ritual of the church. So he's very unsympathetic as far, very much an unbeliever in that. But then look at the other underline that I have that is in the same, he says that a few simple men should in one generation have invented so powerful and appealing a personality and so lofty an ethic and so inspiring a vision of human brotherhood would be a miracle far more incredible than any recorded in the teaching of Christ, in the Gospels. After 2 centuries of higher criticism, the outlines of the life, character, and the teaching of Christ remain reasonably clear and constitute the most fascinating feature in the history of Western man. Now, the only reason I put that one in there is, obviously, as a historian, he believes that there was a man named Jesus. He doesn't believe the Gospels or anything, but he believes that there was a man named Jesus and that he did influence a lot of people. And that's all I'm trying to prove in this step. Any question? Everybody see all I'm doing there is, there's no doubt in a historian's mind that this man, Jesus, was a historical figure. Now we come to step number 2. And this one is probably the one that you have to be very careful and listen to what I'm saying. The body of Jesus was never produced, or the tomb was empty on resurrection morning. That's the point I'm making here, that there's no doubt that either the tomb was empty or that nobody ever found the body. And I say historians and skeptics agree, and I'm talking about unbelievers, that this must be true. And why? Why would the historians and skeptics, agree that the tomb had to be empty? And this is where I think the genius of God is. Christianity is not based upon a philosophy. A philosophy is something like, I don't know what your philosophy of government is, but we have capitalism. Some people like socialism, some like communism, and so forth. What is there about a philosophy that's different than what we're trying to do? A philosophy is subjective. That means that you and I could hold a completely different view of it, and neither one of us could be proved right or wrong. It's subjective. I like capitalism, so I conclude that that's the best form. That's the philosophy. Now, the difference between that and Christianity and Jesus is it's based upon a historical event. And a historical event is very different in that a historical event is either true or not true, right? I don't care. what you believe about it. If you believe different than me, one of us is right and the other is wrong about that historical event. So Christianity is based upon something that is absolute. If Jesus rose from the dead, everything makes sense. If he didn't, nothing makes sense. So this is objective, I say. That is, we can't say that, well, you're right, but you're wrong. You're either right or wrong. And now we may never be able to prove who is right and wrong, but we know that if we're arguing about whether a historical event occurred, and we take different positions on it, one of us is right and one of us is wrong. Does everybody see that? There's no possibility of it. So, what the historians agree that, as I say here, that nobody ever produced the body. They know that if someone had produced the body, what would happen? Because Christianity is based upon a body that rose. Notice this is why a bodily resurrection. A body rose, and we don't see it. If the body could have been produced by anybody, what would happen? Christianity would have been dead on the spot. It cannot exist. Christianity cannot exist with a body. And furthermore, Christianity cannot exist without Jesus. You see, Islam can exist without Muhammad. You can take his writings, that's a philosophy. You live according to that, then you have the blessings. You don't live according to it, you don't. So, whether Muhammad existed or didn't exist is not necessarily material. Similarly with Buddha. But it's not true with Jesus. Jesus had to exist. Otherwise, nothing makes sense. Because if he didn't exist, he couldn't die and he couldn't rise from the dead. Everybody see that? So, all the historians agree that the body was never found. And it's really the definition of what we call gospel. The body of Jesus, we call this gospel or good news. It's a good news that Jesus came back in a body never to die again. Something that he could pass on to us. So Christianity still exists and is propagated by a belief in the facts of the gospel, and it requires an empty tomb. And if the tomb isn't empty, Christianity is dead. There's an interesting thing that I brought. This, if you ever want to read it, you can borrow this or something. This is a book called The Passover Plot. And it's written by Dr. Hugh Schoenfield, who is a Jewish historian. And he has a certain theory of what happened. And he believes that there was a plot set up and so forth. And I'll talk about it a little bit more when I get to the next step. But there's a lot of theories that came up with what happened to this body. And it's very important that a body exists, because I have my son-in-law mother, his first husband, was killed in France in World War II. And they were, for many years, they didn't have a body, and until they found the remains and everything, she could not collect the insurance or anything from the death of her husband, because a body is necessary to prove the death, right? And resurrection, as the case may be. Okay, everybody with me up to this point? So what happened to the body? And that, you might say, most people do say, well, a jillion different things could have happened. But I say there's really only three possibilities. Either enemies got the body, or friends got the body, or he rose from the dead. And I don't think you can. I have one other that I want to throw in at the end that somebody tried to pop on me one time. But I say that's about all. So this is pretty much where most people start who start out with the New Testament. And you can, who are the enemies? Well, the Romans were enemies because Jesus was claiming to be a king, greater than Caesar. And the Jews were enemies because Jesus claimed that if they didn't accept him as king, they were doomed. And so I can eliminate enemies to begin with, because if anybody was an enemy of Jesus and they had the body someplace, what would they do? Bring it out in the middle of the square in Jerusalem and kick it a few times and say, here's your Jesus, and Christianity to die right on the spot. And so that gets us to friends. Friends stole the body, and that's what this guy says. Friends stole the body. And he says what they did, you know, it says in there that somebody gave Jesus some vinegar and gall and everything. They said he was some sort of concoction that made him appear to be dead, and when they took him down from the cross, they gave him to the friends, and they went off and hid the body and so forth. So how do we eliminate that? Well, the first thing we say to ourselves, if they did that, what would we have to conclude? That they're going out and preaching that he rose from the dead, right? All of his friends are going around telling everybody that he rose from the dead. So what do we have to conclude about these people that are preaching that if they have the body someplace? They're liars, right? They're preaching a lie and they know it's a lie. Now, it's not hard to find people that'll lie. But they lie for a reason, don't they? And what is usually the reasons? Are money, power, fame. All the human motivations are there. But we can very easily see that there's no evidence that anyone ever profited, at least not in the days. They were constantly persecuted, they were harassed, and when all they had to do was, one of them would have had to, if just one of them had said, oh no, we got his body and we hid it over here, that would have stopped the persecution. It would have stopped all the the problems they had. And not only that, even if they were telling a lie about it, he would have done it. Even if it would have been true and they told the lie that we hid his body someplace, it would. So you see, friends can't do it, except a lot of people say, well, people because of martyrs, right? 9/11, we saw some people that gave their life to destroy the buildings in New York, right? They were martyrs for the cause for which they were espousing. But what do we know about a martyr? The one thing we know about a martyr is that he believes what he's dying for, right? Those guys that flew, they might not be right about their cause that they did this for, but they believed it was right, and they believed in it. So a martyr always believes what he dies for. He doesn't die for something he knows is a lie. You see, you can't have him that situation. So if a friend had the body, they'd know it was a lie, and even though you say they might have been a martyr, they couldn't be a martyr, because if they died knowing that they had the body someplace, their belief they know is a lie. So I conclude that you can't, friends can't have had the body. I say here, for men to die for publicly proclaiming that a historical event occurred without the normal human motivations, and knowing it is a lie, and that a simple ceasing would eliminate both death and persecution, would be a miracle greater than the resurrection itself. So, I don't know, there are a lot of other things I could throw in here. I don't know how many of you remember the Nixon situation, and how for a while there were people trying to say that certain things and they were lying, and it wasn't long till one of them came out and said, I'm not going to die for this thing. And so I've forgotten what the guy's name was. Dean, wasn't it? John Dean, I think was his name. He came out and told about the plot and everything. So if these apostles were plotting, and one of them were to ever have come out, just one of them, and even if it had been true, well, you see, he could have destroyed the whole thing. But just to get rid of the persecution, So I conclude that there's no way that can be. There's one thing that somebody brought up to me one time, and see if you can. Somebody asked me one time and said, well, what if somebody just stole the body as a practical joke? How do you answer that? That's the one time I thought I was inspired by the Holy Spirit. When somebody asked me that, I thought for a minute. I said, oh God, what on earth? What does a practical joker always want?
Attention.
Attention.
Yeah. And he wants to, at some point out his practical joke, doesn't he?
Yeah, like it's a joke.
So,
joke's on you.
So I pull this off, and so it's amazing what God did here. It made this possible. I want you to know that I don't believe that you have to arrive at this conclusion the way I did. There's nothing wrong with believing what this says or what mom and dad said or anything else. It's just that some of us, like me, were a little too cynical, and I wasn't happy with that. And that's the reason I came up with this. And one other reason that I did this, I've never had a problem with, if I'm trying to get an opportunity to study the Bible with someone, if I tell them, I say, well, if I could prove to you that Jesus died and rose again without even opening the Bible, would you be interested? And almost every time, I've always been able to get a study. I had an atheist who was my deputy when I was at NASA, and I studied it with, I went over it with him. He got to the end and he said, yeah, I don't see any holes in it, but I still don't believe. So it's not, Jesus said that even if a person comes back from the dead, some people won't believe. So it's not foolproof, but it is comforting to me. And when I'm struggling with my Christianity and dealing with people and a little bit of everything, I always fall back on this, but I know Jesus rose from the dead. And, I'm open to any comments you have. I made it in an hour almost.
That was excellent.